Hey everyone, welcome to this second C++ live stream that I'm doing. So if you haven't watched the first one, I'd say definitely go and watch the first one first because I explain a bit more what this is about. But basically it's just, I want to sit down with my codebase and try and explain to you how I use C++ in what I think is the sane way. So that's pretty much it. Do ask questions as we go. It's going to be much more productive, I think, for both of us if people ask questions, make comments. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit more about my C++, as I like to call it. So I never actually think about C++ at all these days. I mean, I've been using it so long now, it's just a language to me and I write stuff in it. I don't ever really think about C++, the good points, the bad points, what should I use, what shouldn't I use, simply just because I've been doing it for so long now that there's no need to. Occasionally I do, obviously I look at new features that come out and think, does that look useful or good? Should I add it to my language? But usually I don't, and my language, my little subset of C++ hasn't really changed a lot over the years. So what I want to show is how you can use a very simplified version of C++ and get stuff done. You know, I've written in my 10x codebase now over 500,000 lines of code, and I'm actively maintaining that 500,000 lines of code. Now, in most projects, you'd have 10 or 20 or 30 people maintaining that much code. So I have to program in a very specific way to actually be able to manage that large amount of code. And that's kind of what I want to get over in these live streams, that there is a different way of using C++, much closer to C. I like to call it C with classes. It's kind of like that, and that's what I really want to get across to you on these live streams. So I'm not actually really going to be talking about C++ or the modern features of it. I mean, we may talk about a few of them and why I don't use them, but for me, it's kind of the other way around. It's like I have a language, which is my subset of C++, and that never changes. And that never changing over like 20 years is really valuable. You know, I don't have to think about it. It's just second nature to me. If you suddenly throw in a new keyword or a new way of writing code, I suddenly have to stop and think about it, which for me, at the pace I'm writing code, I cannot afford to do, really. So I may be stuck in the past to a degree, but on the other hand, it's working and I'm creating software that people are using all around the world, and I'm writing a lot of code, and it's hopefully good quality code and doing its job. So if a new feature in C++ comes along, I almost never adopt it. I almost never really even need to think about it. I'll have a quick look and see, you know, is it something I want to add? So I actually think about it as I'm adding a feature to my language. So say, for example, the auto keyword. I would ask myself, do I want to add auto to my language? Because in my head, I have my language that I'm using. I should give it a name, really. And that language doesn't have auto, so I just never use it. Yeah. So I don't have to worry about the massive enormity of what C++ has now become in modern times. All I have to worry about is my very simplistic language in my head. And so what I've said here is not why not, but why. Why should I add this to my language? Is it solving something that I hit every day in my coding that I'm always getting annoyed about and think, oh, I wish I had this? And usually that's not the case. Usually I'm not on the lookout for something that's to solve a problem, because I've already solved all the problems pretty much that I come across in coding. So it's very rare that I ever think, oh, if only I had such and such feature. I just don't, pretty much. Occasionally I do, but on the whole, I don't. And also, if I am thinking about adding, say, using the auto, which I did briefly think about, should I adopt auto and start using it in my language? What's the price of that? And there is a price to almost everything, obviously. And it's something that not everyone takes into consideration. So the way, if you're writing your own code base, I mean, pretty much everything I'm saying in these talks is if you're writing your own code base and you're developing your own way of using the language. If you're working for a company, obviously you just adopt whatever they say in the standard and you follow everyone else, and that's fine. That's how it should be. But if you're working on your own or in a small team and you want to start thinking about how you're going to use the language, then that's what these talks are about. So you've got to know yourself and how your mind works. And I've realized over the years that my brain is a RISC processor, basically. I'm not very good at remembering lots of things. I haven't got a good memory for words or anything like that. I'm terrible at typing, terrible at shortcuts. And I've realized that if I have a very small amount of instructions, like in my head, or very simple language, then I can work very, very fast. So it's like I've got a reduced processor set in my brain that, I mean, I know some programmers who are amazing at remembering so much stuff, and I'm always in awe of them because I just cannot do that. I have to keep things incredibly simple. And then I work really, really fast on that very simple instruction set or very simple language. So for me, it really matters keeping things simple. So I can use my brain cycles on what matters. Because when I'm coding, like I said right at the start, I never think about C++. I never think, oh, how can I do this in C++? Or what's the best way of doing this in C++? Or which feature should I use or not use? I never think about it. So these talks are quite hard for me because it never even occurs to me to think about it these days. So my brain cycle is always on what I'm actually doing. 100% of my brain is working on what I'm actually coding and how I'm going to solve the problem I'm trying to solve or whatever it is. And that matters to me. So I can't be wasting cycles on thinking about C++. As I said, that's me, and not everyone's like that. Some people are good at remembering stuff and they can use many more features of the language. But the other benefit of doing it this way, keeping things simple, is that for the other people like me out there who can't understand complex C++ syntax, then they'll easily be able to read the code because it's like, a beginner C++ could read most of my code. So it is good if you're working with other people as well. So although my language hasn't evolved much over the years, my usage of it has. And I've been refining it over the years until now. It's so second nature to me that I can write code very fast. It's always structured in the same way. And that's taken time to develop. And I realise that's not something that happens when you're in a large company with lots of other programmers. Because you can't wake up one day and say, right, I've decided we're all going to do it this way and change subtly something in the way you use the language, because you may have 100 other programmers working on the project. So it can't really evolve that much. So I think for people like me who are programming, in your own time, on your own projects, you can gradually evolve your language over time as a subset of the entire C++ language. And a lot of the things I do make sense in the whole. So I put holistically here. So if you just take one thing, you could say, oh, that's a really dangerous thing. You should never do that, like use raw pointers or using namespace or something. You should never, ever do that because it's really dangerous because of X, Y, Z. Well, the reason I do those things is because it fits in with everything else I do. And everything else I do makes sure those things don't go wrong, which will hopefully become clear a bit more tonight. So you've got to look at it as a whole, and that's what I kind of want. It's a really difficult thing to get across, but that's what I want to get across, try and get across in these talks, is my holistic way of using the language. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. So obviously with a language, we're trying to write good code, which obviously has to be correct. But more importantly that, you've got to be able to see that it's correct. You've got to be able to glance at a bit of code and say, yep, that's correct. Or hang on a minute, something looks dodgy there. And keeping code simple and using as few of the language features as possible makes it much easier to see that it's correct at a glance. And obviously maintainable, as I said, I'm maintaining a huge code base now. And, obviously simple code makes maintaining it much easier. I just couldn't maintain this code if it was a big complex mess. And also simple code, you can adapt it much better to future unknowns. So, yeah, these are the things we're trying to aim for in the way that we're using the language. And obviously fast coding I put, because I'm writing, that's always, if you're in a big company writing lots of code, writing it fast is not a major concern at all. It should be the lowest on your list if it's there at all. But for me, I'm working for myself and I've taken on a huge project and I need to write code fast. When it's simple code, some of the code I've got is very, very complex, such as the C++ parser. Obviously, I'm not writing that 100 miles an hour, but a lot of the code I'm writing is very simple or just UI stuff. And I need to be able to code it fast. And for me, being able to code fast is a real bonus. I have to survive as an independent developer. I have to be able to code fast. And not having to think about the C++ language, I never think about C++, that makes me faster at doing what I do. I don't have to sit around reading C++ standards or blog posts of what new feature I should or shouldn't use or when I should use it. So as I said, for all those things, you have to keep code simple. And simple code is often more performant. It performs better in terms of memory and CPU. So writing good code is exactly not about writing fewer lines of code. Not at all. I can't stress that enough. If someone says, oh, I could write these 10 lines of code in one line of code with this fancy C++ feature with this horrible syntax, that's just not an option for me. It's not about writing fewer lines of code. It's about being able to see the code is correct at a glance. And often you can do that easier in 10 lines of code than condensing it down into one complex statement. But I don't think I'm saying anything controversial there. I think most people realize that these days. Simple code usually does have the advantage of being fast too. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Speed also just feels good. Definitely. Yep. So I'm all about speed, as those of you who've been using my 10x editor hopefully realize. So anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's get on to something more concrete. So last time I talked about using namespace, and let's make this a bit bigger. So as I said, I use using namespace in every single CPP file. Like I said before, everything is in my PureDev namespace, and then, for example, I have a 10x namespace inside the PureDev namespace, which contains all the 10x specific stuff. And in the file, I'll do using namespace at the top, and then just use stuff. And I think it was yesterday, I watched a stream about someone was talking about C++ and why you should never use using namespace. Now, what he was saying was the example he gave, one of the examples he gave as to why it was bad was if you do using namespace and then do an include after that, that's obviously dangerous because you could be pulling in stuff that you don't realise. And that's a valid concern, definitely. Obviously, you shouldn't do that. So I also, like I said, everything I say works holistically with everything else. So, I have a thing of I never ever do an include partway through the file. Includes only ever at the top. And then I do my using namespace. And I would never, like I said before, put one of these in a header. And I've never ever had a problem with using namespace. The other reason I don't run into problems is because I would never do a using namespace on a library. Or I would never do, using namespace std if I was using SDL, for example. So never do that. Always, if I'm using some library, I would always I would always do it explicitly like that. And so I would never get clashes. The other thing is I think all of the libraries I use are straight C. I very rarely would ever use a library with a C++ API. Because, lots of reasons. But I like to use libraries that are straight C if possible. So again, I would probably never run into that problem. So yeah, be careful with using namespace. Be careful with what you're pulling in. I mean, like I said, I only use it on my own namespaces. I could just not have them at all and not put anything into my pure dev namespace. And that's what a lot of engines do, I've seen. They'll just put everything into a global namespace and then they never have to do using namespace. But for reasons I said in the last stream, I like to keep everything in my namespace so I can disambiguate it if I need to. And then I just do that. So it's just doing this is equivalent to putting everything into global namespace. And as long as you realise that, then it should be fine. Yeah, so a lot of these things, I watched some of these videos on good C++. I've just, this last week, watched a few of them just to see what other people are saying. Because, like I said, I never think about C++ or even watch videos or read books or anything now. But I decided to watch a few, and a lot of them are very kind of dogmatic. Never ever do this. It's bad C++ if you do this. And I would never say that. It depends what else you're doing. Like auto, I personally would never use auto, but it's not terrible if you do, and it's not bad C++ if you do. So I would never be sort of absolutist about what you should and shouldn't do, because it all works in context. And because I often, when I'm contracting in the games industry, I'll go into different companies and I have to get up to speed like that instantly with their code base and their way of doing things, their coding convention. When I write code, it has to fit in exactly to the way they write code. So I'll use auto, lambdas, whatever, or whatever coding convention they have. I'll just fit in. So, and a lot of the things I think, that doesn't make sense. But then I realise, it makes sense because they do that as well. Yeah. So it's not just about this is good C++ and this is bad C++. What I'm trying to get across in these streams is this is how I personally use C++ as a whole. And for me, using it this way with these conventions and features that's second nature to me now works really, really well. Okay, it works well. I can write a lot of code that's bug-free, does what it's supposed to do, and is easily understandable and easily maintainable, and it's fast. So I can do all those things to a pretty high level, and I'm writing 10, 100 times more code now than I've ever written before in my career. So what I'm saying is it does work. And when you're thinking about new features, you've got to think, how much better would this make the code? So for example, if I was to start using the auto keyword now, how much better would that make my code? So I've written 500,000 lines of code. How many code lines could I have written if I'd used auto? Oh, maybe, 100 lines more. You know what I mean? It's not going to be a big factor of making me more productive. It's going to make maybe a few statements can condense down into a nicer way and make it more readable. If I use XYZ feature of C++, maybe it could eliminate the odd bug or two. If I used lambdas or something, or I don't know, but it's not going to make a huge productivity difference. It does change, like I said, when you're on a big team, because you do have to be more defensive in programming. So using some of the more complex features can be useful. But even then, it's not, whatever convention you've got, as long as you stick to it and you're consistent, it doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it all gels well together. So it's not so much about what features you do use or what you don't use. It's more, does your whole way of programming fit together and work well and work for you? That's what you've got to think of. So, right, what should we go on to next? I've got a few things I could talk about tonight. So anyway, like I said, do ask questions, or even say, can we talk about such and such topic? Because I want to know what you want to go through as well. So last stream, I just picked some files at random from my codebase, and we had a look at those, and quite a few things came up. And I think we can go into a little bit more detail on some of them, because we kind of covered quite a lot in the last stream, but we can maybe go into a bit more detail. And also some questions and comments have come up since the last stream that I'd like to try and address. So the public-private thing, somebody asked about why you use private at all. They like to just keep everything public, and then they don't have to keep writing getters and setters everywhere, which is a fair point. Because they do seem a bit pointless, getters and setters. Why use private at all? My response is just the standard, C++ response of keeping stuff private makes it safer. But I don't always do that. For example, a good example here, I've got a struct here, which literally its only function. So this is just a message to update some lines. What's this file? Text file backup. So every time you change a line, it sends a message with this line, these lines have changed, and this is the indexes, and that's the old count it's replacing. So anyway, this struct is literally just to contain these three variables, and it would be ridiculous to create a class out of this and create accessors and make this private, and then create an accessor, for each thing. You could do that if you wanted to keep it read-only. You could have a constructor which sets it up. Sets the additional values, etc. You pass them in here, whatever. And then it would make the class essentially read-only, so you'd only have get functions, and you would know that nothing can change lines. But to be honest, that's totally overkill in this case. I would just make them public. And I usually, like I said before in the last stream, keep them as structs if they're public. So it's just a container, and it's not doing there's no logic in here. There's nothing complex. It's just containing some data. And I'll sometimes have some quite big classes that. Let's see if I can find one. No, that's one I did actually make private. This is a good example. Is my def class for the parser, parsing symbols. It started off as a struct, and everything was public, because I was getting and setting all these things all over the place, and it didn't make sense to make it private. But then as the class became more complex and started having more complex stuff inside of it, I decided to make it into a proper class, make everything private, and then add getters and setters where necessary. And that was also useful for packing stuff in. So I can easily change stuff internally without obviously everything else in the codebase changing. So my rule of thumb is if the class is complex and doing logic, everything is always private, without exception. Well, one exception I'll show you in a minute, but almost without exception. So everything stays private. And the reason for that is say, for example, I've got an ID, integer member here. If I'm say debugging and I've got MID, which is a bad value, say -1, and it should never be -1. Obviously, if it's private, I know that the place I have to look for the bug is in the CPP file, and the bug can't be anywhere else unless I've got some horrendous memory scribble. Whereas if it was public, I would have to, find references on everything else and find out where it's used in the rest of the code base. And I wouldn't instantly be sure that nothing else is messing with that value. So I'd like to keep it private just to show that nothing else should be changing this. So if there's something wrong with this variable, I know the bug is in here somewhere, not in the rest of the code base. And for me, that's really, really important. I like to keep things compartmentalized so that everything about this struct is in this CPP file. And if I have to write a few getters and setters for the odd member, then fair enough, I'll do that. But I won't make it public. And that's just one of the blanket rules I have. Everything stays private in a complex class. And I never go against that, ever. And it's just one less thing to think about. It's not like, oh, should I make this public and then the rest of it private? Oh, and then I need to make that one public, and then everything else should be private. And then I have to think about it: is this public? Is this private? And then something's wrong with ID, so I think, oh, is that in a public thing or in a private thing? Or I got something down here: is that public or private? Oh, I have to go up here and then see. You know what I mean? It makes it complex. Whereas if everything is private, I just know it's all private. I don't have to check. I don't have to check where it is. I don't have to check what accessor it's got. I just know everything is private. It just makes me feel whole lot better about the code. So I'm a big fan of keeping stuff private in a class. Is there a reason you use UTF-16 string type? I've seen W means wide. Isn't that a little bit wasteful on memory, especially if you parse the whole codebase, considering most text is ASCII? So yeah, I hope you got that. So yeah, it's not UTF-16. Excuse me. It's not UTF-16. It's wide chars, and there is a difference. And yes, it does use up twice the amount of memory, obviously. And it's interesting. It was only probably after I started writing 10x that I switched to wide chars everywhere. And because I used to use single byte chars everywhere, just because I didn't need wide chars at all, really, and I didn't want the extra memory. But when I started writing 10x, I realized that there are so many things that need the extra code points that wide chars can provide. And actually the 10x editor uses wide chars for everything now, and that's how it can display different characters from different languages, and the non-ASCII chars. And I just realized it was so much easier just to have a blanket rule of I use wide chars everywhere now, and I never use single byte chars, because obviously in 10x I need it, but in general it's not worth the hassle. The memory saving of using single byte chars, I've decided now, anywhere in any code base, is really not worth the hassle. Or the memory saving is not worth the hassle of, oh god, what do? I need to display this non-ASCII char. So I just decided to bite the bullet. We're in 64-bit apps now, memory is always a problem, but it's not that much of a problem that I can't move to wide chars everywhere. I do find it tedious that I'd had to write L before all strings. So I wish there was a way in a language where I didn't have to do that. So for example, like that. That's tedious and annoying. But anyway, that's one of the small things that I decided to live with, because it's just, rather than mixing single byte chars and wide chars everywhere, it's just a whole lot easier. So, should we talk about next? I don't think, unless anyone's got any questions, there was nothing else I was going to say on the private thing. I'm sure we could say an awful lot more about public-private, but I think it's fairly well accepted that, you use private unless it really has to be public. Oh yeah, the only time I do go against that rule, and this is a recent thing for me, don't know if it's gonna, can I find an example? That's weird. Okay, some random file where we can't render recall device reset callback for D39. So I talked about these in the last stream, so I'm not going to go over that again. But these are basically my event classes, so you can subscribe to these by doing device reset callbacks add, and then a function pointer, and then it will call that when the device gets reset. And it's something that I followed from a lot of my C# programming, where events are public, and you can just do event plus equals my function, because it's very tedious to write a getter and setter for this, and they'll always be the same. It's not as if I ever want to keep this private. It'll always have a getter, and never obviously have a setter, but it'll always have a getter and always do the same thing. It was just, I use this all over the place for so many things, especially in 10x, and it was just pointless and tedious to write getters for every single one. So this is the only exception I made, and this is quite a recent thing for me. It's like, I made something public. My God, that's amazing. But yeah, I decided it is worth doing that, and I'm happy with that. I've been using it so long now. They're always last in the class, these functions, and I just have public here, so nothing will come after this and suddenly start magically being public. So that's a convention I've got. Events and functions are always last, and they're always public, and that's worked really well for me. So yeah, I'm willing to break my own rules, but only in rare cases and not without a lot of thought. And I don't think there are any other exceptions than that. Like I said, I always do public first, constructor, destructor, and then protected if I have any, which I rarely do, and then private, and then the data. And every single class is laid out exactly the same way. It doesn't matter how you lay out your class, as long as it's consistent in every single file, and you just know where to look for stuff. So yeah, anyway, another question. Thanks for the answer, but does that mean 10x doesn't support code points with values more than 65535? Yes, it does, but that's not usually an issue. I've never come across a codebase, or haven't yet so far come across a codebase that uses characters that aren't in that range. So, I mean, I've loaded as 10x supports various different encodings, but that's just for loading the file in, even Japanese Shift.js encodings, and then when it loads in, obviously it goes to wide chars. Now, most editors will use 4-byte chars to cover absolutely everything, and I may move to that one day. I'm hoping I won't have to, because I think it's, it must be pretty rare to ever come across. I'm probably going to regret saying this, but it must be rare to come across any C++ or code file that has chars outside that range. But anyway, we'll see, because a lot of fonts don't even support code points outside that range. So we'll see. It's a calculated risk I took at the start of 10x, just because I already had a wide char string class, and it was just easier to use that everywhere. So anyway, let me know if you find a code file that isn't displaying correctly in 10x, and I'll think again. But it shouldn't be a too big a change, I hope. Just creating a new string class with 4-byte chars and using it everywhere. So it's probably a month or two of work. But yes, that is correct. Right. Just trying to think. I don't think there's anything else I can say about public and private. Okay, let's move on. So I mentioned auto last time, and I thought we could go into a little bit more detail on it. Like I said, I don't use it just because I've never had a need for it. And in general, I've seen it abused a lot in other code bases, and I don't find it helps code readability. So something one person did say was they use it when they're just writing code for the first time and don't really care about the type, just stick auto in there, and then later on they'll use the IDE to replace it with the type before submitting the code, and that's fine. I would see that as an IDE feature really, because the IDE obviously has to support that, and not all IDEs or editors do support resolving auto, because it's a pretty complex thing to have to do. 10x does it to a degree, but it can't work out all of the types yet. Hopefully it'll get better over time. But yeah, you're kind of relying on the IDE to be able to do that. So that's fine if you want to do it that way. But again, I would never submit code with auto in it. Someone else pointed out it's bad for refactoring, obviously. If you've got a function which is returning a type, and then somewhere I'm using it then if I change the type to my class 2, obviously that will just compile, and you could say, yeah, that's great, that's what I want, but you could also say, well, actually I want everywhere that where I thought this was a my class, I'm now going to go through and have to change it to my class 2, and I actually want to do that. If I change this to my class 3, I want it not to compile, and the compiler will tell me everywhere that I've used my class 2, and I have to go, oh, it's now my class 3, and I think I'll rename that to test 3 or whatever. I'll do a lot of that, and you could say that's extra work, but for me, it's incredibly useful, especially when I'm refactoring code. You don't want it just to magically work. You want a compiler to catch stuff and tell you what you need to change. So I think that's a really good point for auto. It's not always great for refactoring. So recently I did actually consider using auto. And let's find an example. Yeah, that'll do. So let's have a look at this. So the way I used to do my iterators was, say, my map class which is just a standard binary tree. We'd have an iterator class in it. So this is my map class over here. And as you can see, it has an iterator. You just pass in a reference to the map that you're iterating over, etc. All fairly standard. But it's not bad, and I kind of didn't mind it, but it's a bit tedious having to write this the whole time. Obviously, if this was STL, it would probably look a lot worse than this and be a lot longer. So if you're using STL auto, you kind of need it because it's so horrendous, the templates. Mine's not too bad, but it's still, I was thinking, should I do something like this? Oops. Thank you, autocomplete. That. And then I don't have to write the horrible type. And the reason I was thinking of using it for my iterators is because you don't need to know a lot about your iterators. They're just iterators. You know, you just increment them, and you have a get value, get key, or whatever. And they're not complex things, so I don't really care. I know it's an iterator because I've called it iter. I don't really care what type it is. So I was considering changing the way I do my for loops, and maybe using auto in that case, because it could be beneficial if I only ever used it in that case. But in the end, I went for range-based for, which actually, thinking about it, isn't a whole lot better. Anyway, I'm not going to go through that, but basically I use range-based for, which makes a lot of stuff a lot easier. I don't have to use iterators everywhere. And yeah, I decided I don't need auto, not going to use it. Because once you start, like I said before, my language that I use doesn't have auto. It doesn't have the auto keyword. So if I was to say I'm going to add auto to my language in my head, I've suddenly made my language just a tiny bit more complex. And I have to think, should I use auto in this case or should I use it in this case? And I would have to think about it. And I don't want to have to think about, should I use this feature or that feature? Maybe if I grew up with auto, I wouldn't have to think about it so much. But again, I can't stress how important it is, for me at least, to keep the language as simple as possible. So I don't want to have to think about, should I use auto here or shouldn't I? Get rid of all that. There's one other example. I think someone said they use auto. Say if they're allocating something. Because I mean, we've already got the type twice in this line already. So if I was to add it a third time, it may be overkill. I can kind of see the reasoning on that. This is definitely a my class. It's everywhere. I mean, I never really write code like that anyway, but I know it can be useful. And yeah, it's not a terrible thing. But again, it's something I would have to think about. And also when I'm reading the code, every single variable in my entire codebase has the type on the left. If I come across a line that has auto, what's the type of this? Oh, auto. Oh, I have to look on the right. It's just a tiny little thing to think about that is different from everything else. Whereas I know that I can always look to the left of the variable and see the type. And it seems absolutely trivial, and I'm not stupid. I can do it. You know, I can work it out. But why should I have to? Let's just keep it as simple as possible. And I don't even have to look at the rest of this line. You know, I just blank that out if I want to know what's this, what's the type of it. Oh, there it is. And also, what happens if I have this on a separate line? You know, later when I hover over it somewhere, Obviously, yeah, okay, you can see that one. But I just see the type as auto, and maybe my IDE doesn't resolve auto in the hover over like 10x. So, there are lots of little things where you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have used auto in that case. Why even bother thinking about it? Just don't think about it, just do everything the same. That's my rule. And then you always know where you're at, and it's just simpler. It's so tempting to think, I got this new feature in a language, so I'll use it. And you've got to think, do I really need it? Is it really going to make my life that much better? Just to add another thing I've got to think about. And it's only a tiny thing, so it's only a tiny thing, it doesn't matter. But when you add it all up over millions of lines of code, it does matter. And that's what I want to stress, is keep the language as simple, as basic as possible, and try and write everything with the fewest amount of language features that you can. And I think you'll end up with much simpler and much more readable and maintainable code. But anyway, that's just what I think. Someone said, not using auto and changing types can also make you review surrounding code to see if there's any side effects from the changes. Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think I covered that just now. So yeah, auto is hiding stuff from the future person viewing the code, whether that's you or someone else. You don't want to hide stuff. You want to make everything as obvious and as explicit as possible. So I've done that. Why should I add auto to my language? Yeah, I haven't come across a case yet where I thought, oh, I could really use auto here. And even if I did, it would probably just be one case out of 1,000. And I think, oh, I found a case where I can use auto and it's better, so I'll use it. And then I've used it in one case in 1,000. And I've got to think, oh, what's the cost of that? I've just added a whole new keyword to my language that I've got to worry about. Why do that? It's not going to make, for me, adding a new keyword to my language is a big thing. Is using that keyword in this specific case, yes, it may be better, but is it that much better it's worth adding a new keyword? No, usually not. Do you see? It's a different way of thinking about it. So it's not, I've got this C++ language, it's got all these things, and which one should I use for this line, and which one should I use for that line? It's not, for me, it's not like that at all. I've got this very simple language, and I write everything with that simple language, and I don't have to think which of these myriad of features should I use in this case. So I think we've done auto as much as we can, unless anyone has any comments on that, or if people have got other examples like this one of where auto could be used. They're not bad examples. I'm not going to say, no, you shouldn't do that. I would say, yeah, that's a good example. In that case, in that one specific case, it's good. And if you're already using auto everywhere else in the code base, why not use it? Yeah, it's fine. It's not bad C++. But if you were to say, well, I've never used auto anywhere in my entire code base, and I'm thinking of starting to use auto because this one specific line demands it, or I'm doing this a lot, then maybe, like I said, I was considering using auto, but I decided not to in the end. And there's nothing else I need auto for. It's never something I would find useful, so I haven't added it to my language. And that's where you've got to start thinking. As you write more and more code, the way you use the language starts to kind of solidify, and you kind of have your own way of using the language. And everyone who writes a lot of code themselves eventually sort of starts to settle on a specific way of using the language. And I mean, I've been in code bases before on large teams where everyone tries to stick to the standard of the company, but you can kind of always tell who's written a bit of code, even just little subtle things like where they indent stuff, or is there a space between the if and the bracket, or, tiny little things, and you think, oh, so-and-so's written that code. And that's actually quite useful a lot of the time, I found. Everyone has their own kind of signature. But obviously in a big code base, you do want people to conform to the same standards as much as possible. So it's more about being consistent than being right. Never walk into a company and say, no, you're doing that wrong. It's better to be, even if it's wrong, even if it definitely is wrong, it's better to be consistent everywhere and be consistently wrong, because at the very least you know what to expect. It's when you sometimes use it and sometimes don't. Half the code base has auto and another half doesn't have auto, and should I use auto or shouldn't I use auto? And that's when you really have to start thinking about the language, and I never think about the language, as I said, and that's super valuable to me. I don't want to think about the language. So I'm probably not going to talk about lots of complex C++ other than just to say this is why I wouldn't ever use it. And that's really what I want to get across in these talks. Auto is a side effect from the god-awful crap they've added to STL. Yes, exactly. And so much of the modern language features are there because of shortcomings of the rest of modern C++. And auto is a perfect example of that. If STL wasn't such a complete horrible mess, you probably wouldn't ever have needed auto. Nobody would have said, I'm fed up with typing all this junk, can't I just use auto? Nobody would have thought of that. And in my codebase, like I said, I don't have big, long, complex template classes everywhere, so I just don't need auto. And once you start seeing that, a lot of the modern C++ features are there to fix other problems that are in C++. And instead of fixing the problem in C++ and making it simpler, they think, we can fix it by adding this new feature. And then that new feature has problems. So they think, we can fix that by adding yet another feature. And it starts to become this horrible, complex mess, in my opinion. So my thing is, in everything in life, keep it simple. There's less to go wrong, and it's much easier to work with. And hopefully, as you see more of my code, you'll see it is very, very simple code. There's nothing in there that a beginner in C++, wouldn't really understand. They might not understand the concepts of what I'm doing, but the actual code, they could look at and work out and say, yep, I know exactly what that's doing. And I think that's the way it should be, really. We don't need to write all these complex statements. Tabs or spaces? Tabs, of course. So recently I did hear a good argument for using tabs, actually. First time I've ever heard in all my entire programming career, because it's really not something you should waste any time on. But they said it was for people with really poor eyesight. They'll make the code, so for example, I think there's a limit to how big I can make it. They'll make the code really big to be able to actually see the code. And then obviously a lot of stuff goes over the right end, of the screen. So they can go into settings and make the tab size, say 1 char wide, and then everything gets indented to the left-hand side. So yeah, there is an argument that tabs are better for people with visual impairment. A bit like me, I have very poor eyes, but thankfully I don't have to make the fonts that big usually. So yeah, I think as there's no good argument I've seen for spaces, then I think tabs wins, to be honest. And also I do a lot of just the way I code, I move the cursor around an awful lot. So when I'm reading something, as you probably often see, I'll often move the cursor to what I'm actually looking at and maybe even highlight it. And I move the cursor around a lot when I'm going around files, like this. So then I go down to this one and then this one. If I have spaces, I have to go like that to get there, or control, obviously you can do that. But for me, just because I'm so used to tabs, I'm used to just jumping around a code base like this with the cursor keys. So I get really annoyed when I have to use code bases with spaces because I suddenly have to start doing that. Anyway, that's such a minor point, it's not even worth mentioning. And I was thinking in 10x I could create a pseudo tab, so if the file has spaces in, it would actually treat it as a tab and skip over all the spaces, which would help me an awful lot in code bases with spaces. So anyway, everyone should use tabs, and that's the end of it. Yeah, but seriously, it really doesn't matter. Did you start with C++ and refine your style? Did you start with C as a base, adding nice features onto it? What do you like about C++? That's a really good question. So I started with C because when I started programming, C++ didn't exist, or at least wasn't widely used. And I think that's definitely changed my style. So the way I use C++ is much more like C, I'd say, than it is C++ in a way. So rather than starting with C++ and all the complex features and then refining it down, I started with C, and then when I was learning C++, every new feature like classes, I had to understand what class was and why you would use it. I remember reading a book. I read my one and only programming book I think I've ever read is a book on C++, where I just sat down and read it and tried to understand it. I said, why use classes? I don't need them. You know, I structured everything by file, so in the header I'd have all the functions, declarations, and the CPP I'd have, or the C.C file I would have all the function implementations, and I broke it down like that. Why would I need a class? And so what I've been explaining tonight as to why would I add feature X to my language, that's how I transition from C to C++. So I only took on the things that made sense to me of C++. And it was interesting actually because a couple of days ago I watched a stream about someone saying why they program in C. And it was really good stream, good video. And a bit like this one, he was saying he likes to keep things very simple. And almost everything he said, I said, well, yeah, that's how I use C++. And it was interesting because he was, I don't know how common this is with C programmers these days, but they kind of are simulating a lot of the features of C++. So they would have functions like named. He was saying the longer the name is, the better. And I love long names, so I don't disagree with that. And also, like passing in, I think he was using void pointers for everything. Let's say it was array add. Something like that. My response would be, well, the way I do that is instead of using underscores, I use double colons and namespaces. Do you see what I mean? And I was kind of thinking about it and thinking, yeah, the way he was using C is actually almost the same way as I use C++, except I use namespaces, because then I can also do let's get rid of containers because that's a stupid example. I can say, well, actually, I can do using namespace period f, and then I don't have to write this long thing. I can just use array add, but I can if I want to. So I think for me, I'm like a C programmer that uses C++, for example, classes as syntactic sugar, what we used to call syntactic sugar. I don't know why it's called syntactic sugar, but anyway, it's what we used to call it. So a lot of the way this C program was programming was the same way as I program, pretty much, in C++, except I'll use the classes in this example. And there are a few other examples like that that I thought of, and I found that very interesting. So what do you like about C++? I like classes, you know. I like the fact, because this C programmer was saying data and code are separate, and obviously they are, you know, in memory. They're totally different things in a way. And we shouldn't pretend that they're one thing. But then he showed his array class with all these functions, copy array, add, pass in the array. You know, that's the same as, you know, doing array, you know, add, and you're passing in the this pointer essentially implicitly. Except you don't have to in C++, which is nicer. I know this is an array. I don't have to pass in the this pointer, and that's the this pointer basically. So I like the fact, I like classes, and I like stuff, like I was saying earlier, you can make stuff private. And I could program my whole codebase in C and get around those things, just like he's done here with the longer function names, and that's fine, you can do that. But for me, it wouldn't be cleaner. It would make everything a bit more verbose. And essentially, in both cases, you're doing exactly the same thing. So yeah, I like that, and I like inheritance in C++, but I use it very rarely. So I think I could probably do a whole session on inheritance and when shouldn't use it. And maybe I will next time. Let me know what you'd like for us to go through. But yeah, I like inheritance, but I use it very, very sparingly. In the cases where it's useful, it's incredibly useful. But like everything else in C++, it's often abused and used far too much. Anyway, I'll talk about that another time. Just trying to think if there's anything else I like about C++. I like templates, but again, I use them very sparingly. I'm just trying to think where, it's mostly in my core libraries. You can see I use templates. In fact, that's pretty much, a little bit of my XML thing, that's pretty old now. And my stream classes. So yeah, it's only my core libraries and stream classes that I use templates. But again, they're incredibly useful in the few cases where you need them. So I like that about C++. Just trying to think of anything else. I can't really think of anything else off the top of my head. I'm sure there's more stuff. But no, that's that. Classes, templates, inheritance, public, private. That's C++ for me, really. Nothing else. God, one of the few cases I've used friend. That's about in my entire code base. I've probably done that 2 or 3 times. Just trying to find anything else. I've recently started using enum classes instead of the old C enums, and they're quite nice. Doing that. So rather than putting it in a namespace, which is what I did for all my other ones, I would just do that. And that is a lot nicer, I must admit. So that is one of the few more modern things I have taken on, because there's no drawback to doing it that I could see. Yeah, can't think of anything else. Eyesight is my argument for avoiding the not operator, if not something. Yeah. Something equals false. I can miss a formula at a glance. Yeah, that is a fair point. I don't do that. So, for example, if I was doing not complete here and the code was a lot smaller, I could miss the not. And I've seen people, define not like that, or like you say, do equals false. So yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, personally, my eyesight is bad, but not quite that bad, and I've never had a problem missing the not. I often forget to put it on, but that's just me forgetting or getting my booleans the wrong way around. I've never actually had a problem seeing it, fortunately. But yeah, that's a good comment. What I really detest is things like that, where you put the value you're testing first instead of last. That's just horrendous to me. And I know why they do it, because they can't accidentally do this. But that's never been an issue for me. And the compiler now picks it up almost always. So if I was going to do equals, I would always put it on the right, just because it reads better. If complete is false, then return 0. For me, that reads properly. I don't say if false equals complete. If false is complete, no. If false is the same as complete, it just doesn't read for me at all. And I think people are just being clever because they say, oh, I found a way of avoiding that problem. But it's really not clever in my book. So yes, please don't do that. Yoda operator, yes, exactly. Yeah, if you think and speak like Yoda, then it's probably completely fine. But if you're a normal human being, then it's not so good. Right. So yeah, let me know if you've got anything else you want to go through. I've been noting down some other things I can talk about. Lambdas, I think we could talk about a bit more. Even though I don't use them, I could maybe. I was going through my code and where's it gone? I was going through a case in my code where I could have used a lambda to see what it would look like. I'm not going to go through this now, but maybe we could do that next time. So I was coming up with various different versions of adding lambdas to my code and seeing what it looked like, and then comparing it to what I have and saying, is it better or isn't it better? And so far I'm not convinced, but I'll go through that with you another time. And the other things I was thinking about we could talk about were inheritance, like I said just now, class inheritance. There's quite a lot I think that could be said on that, because it often, like I said, does get abused. Const, I've had my relationship with const has changed over the years, so we can definitely talk about that. Const expression, never used, I never want to, and I can tell you why in another stream, and exceptions and things like that. So yeah, if you would like to talk about any of those things, let me know. Let me know what you would find the most valuable or the most interesting that you think. Or if anything that's not on that list, you say, well, why don't you use feature X in C++? Then, let me know and we can go through it, and I can maybe... Because what I want to do is, instead of showing contrived examples, because I realised when I was trying to prepare for this stream that it's very difficult to come up with a really good example of why you should never use feature X. And because like some of the streams I watched, they were saying, we never use using namespace because of this contrived example, which it would go wrong. And that's correct, and it looks right, and you think, oh yeah, that must be it then. But like I said, everything is in context, and everything is, you've got to look at it as a whole. So I could come up with contrived examples of why I never use lambdas and come up with this really horrible lambda example. But that's not really that helpful. I think it's much better to see code in situ, real code. And that's why I wanted to just pick a file at random in my codebase and go through it and say, would it be better if I used auto or lambdas in this case? And what would it look like if I did? And that's what I've started to do here. But I haven't finished that yet, so I'll leave that for now. But I think these streams are not going to be me preparing these very perfect examples and slides and code fragments and stuff. I think it's much more constructive and helpful to see real code that works and does real things, because when you're learning, say, a language at university or something, or from a book, they always come up with contrived examples, and I think that's where a lot of the problems stem from, is people who have been taught C++ and class inheritance from a book, where you inherit everything from everything else. And that's why we end up with these horrendous class hierarchy structures in code that really don't need to be there. So I think personally it's much more valuable to look at real code and say, is this good code? Could it be better? Should it be using this feature or shouldn't it? Or is there a different way of doing this? Because there's almost always a different way of doing something that doesn't use the sort of complex feature that you think you might need. So anyway, I hope you found that useful. Thanks for all your questions again. That was really good. Definitely email me, contact me via the website. If you specifically want to ask me a question I can answer in one of these sessions, or if you just want to talk about a specific topic, then please do get in touch. And thanks for watching. And either contrived or really simplified examples. They're either too contrived or too simplified. It's very, very hard to get a really good example. So I'm going to try and use my codebase and we'll see how that works. So I think next time we will start with lambdas, as I've got this code. I'll shelve it and keep it there. So we'll talk about lambdas next time and then see how long that takes and see where we go from there. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week at 7 p.m. Bye for now.